we're going to discuss the Maryland Occupational Safety and Health Administration's issued long-awaited heat stress standards. So these heat stress standards were issued last year, and they were implemented to protect employees from heat hazards. As we enter into the warmer months of the year, we thought it was a good time to remind employers that may be covered by the heat stress standards of their obligations under the law. So at the outset, covered employers under the standards are those with employees who work activities, whether they be indoor or outdoor, that expose them to a heat index in the area where the employee is working of 80 degrees Fahrenheit or higher. So if your employees, when they're working, are exposed to heat of 80 degrees Fahrenheit or higher, you're going to be covered under the heat stress standards. However, the regulation excludes from coverage any emergency operations, any incidental exposures. So if an employee performs work activities for less than 15 consecutive minutes per hour, they're not going to be covered. And buildings, structures, and vehicles that have a mechanical ventilation system or a fan that maintains the heat index below 80 degrees Fahrenheit. So if you have AC, not to fear, you are not covered. Now, if you are a covered employer, you are required to monitor the heat throughout the work shift. This is because, as we'll discuss in a moment, employer requirements under the regulation can vary depending on the temperature. Employers can monitor the heat index through directly measuring the temperature and humidity, using the National Weather Service or other recognized source to provide the temperature, or using the NIOSH heat safety tool application, and that's just an app that you could get on your phone. Now, employers must use direct measures of temperature and humidity when employees work in buildings and structures that do not have a mechanical ventilation system. So if you have an employee that's working in a building without AC, without air conditioning, that reaches at least 80 degrees, employers are going to have to directly measure the temperature and humidity within that building. Employers with employees who are exposed to heat at or above 80 degrees Fahrenheit must develop, implement, and maintain an effective written heat-related illness prevention and management plan. Sounds like a lot. Don't worry, we're going to break it down. The plan requirements are detailed under the standard. The plan must include a number of things, like how sufficient amounts of cool, clean drinking water will be provided. So under the regulations, employers must provide drinking water at no cost to exposed employees as close as practical, to employee work areas. So you have to have close, clean drinking water. You have to provide at least 32 ounces of drinking water per hour to employees, and you must provide ready access to drinking water at all times. So the plan says, look, you have to detail how you're going to provide sufficient amounts of cool water to employees. The plan also has to include how employees will be provided sufficient opportunities and encouragement to stay hydrated by drinking water, how to recognize symptoms of heat-related illness, including heat exhaustion and stroke, how to respond to suspected heat-related illness, including heat exhaustion and stroke, how employees will be provided with sufficient time and space to rest in shaded or cool, climate-controlled areas to cool off. So importantly, under the regulation, an employer must provide shaded areas, or again, climate-controlled areas to employees. Shade or shaded areas must block indirect sunlight and be located as close to the work area as possible. Shaded areas must also be outside, open, and exposed to air on at least 3 sides. Prevent contributing heat sources from reducing effectiveness. Be sufficiently sized for the number of employees utilizing the shaded area. Be arranged in a configuration that allows employees to sit in a normal posture and accommodate the removal of any PPE. An employer can also, again, provide a climate-controlled area with air conditioning to employees as long as it meets those requirements. The plan must also include how the employer will implement rest break schedules as necessary, how the employer will consider environmental conditions, required clothing, again, PPE, and alternative cooling and control measures like misting equipment or cooling vests when determining rest break schedules, how employees will be encouraged to take rest breaks as needed to prevent heat-related illness, how employees will be trained on hazards of heat exposure and the necessary steps to prevent that heat-related illness, the use and maintenance of alternative cooling and control measures, procedures for heat acclimatization, which we'll get to in a moment, and an emergency response plan, which we'll also cover in a moment. So as you can tell, a significant amount of information is required to be included in this plan. Now, as I mentioned, the plan must include procedures for heat acclimatization. So this is just referring to the body's temporary adaptation to work in heat that occurs as a person is exposed to heat over a period of time. Commentary to the regulations state that over 70% of heat-related deaths occur during a worker's first week of work exposed in the heat. So the regulations take into account that employers need to limit workers newly exposed to heat and gradually increase their exposure to heat. So this is just what's referred to as that acclimatization period. So under the regulations, an employer must provide a period of up to 14 days when workers are newly exposed to heat in the workplace and when a worker returns to work 7 or more days after an absence. So in essence, you have a 14-day period to get acclimated to heat at the beginning of your employment and if you take an absence of 7 or more days that are consecutive. During this period, employers must develop a schedule for heat acclimatization. There are options for how to do this, such as gradually increasing exposure over a 5 to 14-day period with a maximum 20% increase each day. And during this period, employers are required to monitor employees for signs of heat-related illness. Again, the regulation, the commentary to it emphasizes that most heat-related deaths are occurred during when workers are first exposed to the heat. So the regulations really emphasize employer monitoring of employees to ensure their safety in heat as they're newly exposed to it. Employers must monitor employees through regular communication via the phone or radio, a buddy system, or another effective means of observation. The schedule must be in writing, and the plan itself must also be in writing and be made available and accessible to employees and to MOSH upon request. Employers must also implement additional written requirements to address when temperatures rise to high heat conditions, and that means at or above 90 degrees Fahrenheit. High heat procedures should include a minimum rest period of 10 minutes for every 2 hours worked, a minimum rest period of 15 minutes for every hour worked where employees are exposed to a heat index above 100 degrees Fahrenheit, and monitoring employees for signs of any heat-related illness through regular communication. Employers must also include and implement a written emergency response plan that contains procedures for ensuring effective means of communication at all times at the work site to enable an employee to contact a supervisor or emergency medical services, procedures for responding to signs and symptoms of possible heat-related illness in employees, procedures for monitoring and providing care to employees who may be exhibiting symptoms of any heat-related illness, and also procedures for contacting emergency medical services if necessary. There is also a training requirement in the regulations. Employees covered under the regulations must receive heat stress training, prior to initial heat exposure, annually, and immediately following any incident at the work site involving a suspected or confirmed heat-related illness. The training must be presented in a language and manner that all employees can understand. It also has to cover certain topics under the regulations, like the employer's heat stress plan, any risk factors that could affect heat-related illness, signs and symptoms of illness, and also reporting any symptoms of illness. Training records must be kept for 1 year from the date on which the training occurred, and they also have to include the name of who attended the training, the dates of the training sessions, and a summary or outline of the content of the training sessions. So Maryland employers covered under this law should review the new requirements, develop their plans, and provide training to employees to comply with the law. And now I will turn it back over to Jessie.
Thank you, Nicole.